This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on human origins and migration. So in our last unit, as we're starting this up, much of this is going to sound like a review, and the reason why is because there's so much tying together now that we've been studying about all year. And I want you to see human migration as just such a central part of what human beings do. Probably one of the biggest continuities is human migration and human trade. So as we're talking about this, you're going to see a lot of repetition from what we talked about during the year, but this is so central to understanding how human beings seem to have this desire to go out, explore and discover and find new things in order to innovate. And so really what we're seeing here is the tying together of everything we've talked about with culture and ideology and economics. And probably like the main thesis that we should take away from this is how human migration has led to the development of sedentary and eventually large empires and nation states. And so the question is, how is migration now really tied into the way we're seeing human beings interact today in the modern era? So we start off back at big history. Remember that when we started off the year with big history, the big concept behind big history is this idea of cosmology, an explanation of the origins of the universe and how this affects our view of human nature and purpose. This is so important because we don't study history just to learn about a lot of facts. We study about it in order to understand significance. And the biggest start to history, human history, is our cosmology. How do we view the universe and our place within it? So we know that the Big Bang probably took place about 14 billion years ago. And when that took place, there was this random occurrence in which there was a total explosion of gases and basic elements. And we kind of know from this that it took over 150,000 years for all of these gases and elements to actually expand outwards and start forming into what we see today. And that is the formation of stars and then eventually planets. This raises a concept in science called entropy. And here's the idea of entropy. The idea is that if the window of the Big Bang had just been slightly bigger, the universe just would have fallen apart. It would have evaporated. If the window had been just slightly smaller, the universe would have collapsed in on itself. So this really raises a question, and the question that we've been talking about since the beginning of the year is when we look at our cosmology, how do you view the universe? Do you view the universe as sort of random chaos? That there was this Big Bang and it led out into the order that we see, but it really was random in the way it happened? Or do you view it as something that was purposeful, that there was an intelligent design? Either way that you view that is going to have major conclusions on how you view human beings' place within this universe. So the early humans probably come from this group that are known as the Homo sapiens. And the Homo sapiens begin to move out of Africa. This is the out of Africa thesis, about 100,000 years ago. The main technology at that point was just stone tools. Eventually, about 60,000 years ago, we find evidence of civilizations in Australia. And we know that 10,000 years ago, a group of Indians that we call the Clovis Indians migrated over the Bering Strait into the Americas. We also know that the Polynesians within Southeast Asia used double hull canoes to sail out into the South Pacific and Micronesia, and they sailed out over a total area of 16 million square miles. When you think about how amazing it is that at this time period the technology that humans had was so primitive compared to what we see today, and yet their ability to go out and explore and migrate and find new areas and take the risks involved in finding these new areas, I mean, you think about it, they had no idea that there would be some end destination to where they were going to, and yet they went out to try and find these areas. And we've talked in class about possibly the reason behind this is due to the massive climate change that took place. Human beings were kind of forced out, but then they also voluntarily chose to go into the regions that were most dangerous in order to try to find areas in which they could settle. This eventually led to early social organization. Now, at this point in world history, strangely enough, there were only about 10,000 people who lived on Earth, when we consider that in contrast to today of 6 to 7 billion people who live on the Earth. At this point, women were gatherers, men were hunters. And within the hunter-gatherer society, it appears that women and men were relatively equal in status. Most societies were still patriarchal, with men in charge, but women held a huge amount of influence, and a big part of that had to do with the fact that they were seen as tied to the earth and reproduction. And so women not only had a matriarchal role in the fact that their lineage defined the way that the tribes went, but then on top of that, that would allow them to have influence over the men. In most of these societies, there was also the development of a priestly class, a group of people who held a religious authority, and what they would do is that they would tie into the gods of nature or the gods of animism. Eventually, we know that as people migrated outwards, they formed sedentary communities. And some of the main key issues I want you to remember with sedentary communities are the development within the Middle East of cereal and grain farming. This is actually going to be really important to the people of the Middle East because it allows for them to develop the food surplus needed in order to really grow the population. At the end of the Ice Age, a mini global warming phenomena allowed for this development of agricultural surplus, as well as the Neolithic Revolution and the development of new types of tools based upon metallurgy, bronze and iron. Some of the main communities that settled at this time period were in the Euphrates, the Nile, the Tigris, and the Indus River Valley. And as we talked about since the beginning of the year, notice how important river systems are. And this may seem so obvious, but think about all the impacts that river systems had. Who was going to be able to control the water? What do you do with flooding from waters? How do you control those flooding of waters in order to make sure that there's an orderly amount of water coming in for irrigation? Within the Mesoamerican region, those Clovis Indians who eventually were able to come over the Bering Strait and settled, many of these different tribes that came out from underneath them settled in deserts and needed to create some type of way to do irrigation. And they tended to do that through swamps. So about 12,000 years ago, there was the Neolithic Revolution, in which we created things like metallurgy. But that also allowed human beings to start to domesticate animals and plants. The climate had changed due to the Ice Age, and then there was this new global warming phase. One of the big effects to kind of demonstrate this was the Saharan Desert, which had been receiving plenty of rainfall and provided Africans with farming potential. And then as we see the glaciers kind of moving away, we're eventually going to see that area turn into a desertified area. Now, one of the big differences between Europe and Mesoamerica, it's really important to remember, is the Mesoamericans lacked the cereal grains that were necessary in order to really develop their civilizations. Now, here's the ironic part about that. Mesoamericans did not have weak civilizations. In fact, in many ways, their civilizations dwarfed that of Europe and many other places around the world. But in the long run, the difference was the Mesoamericans did not have the types of cereal grains that would allow them physically over the long run to really develop in a way that would be more dominating in contrast to the areas of the Middle East in China and Europe. So what were the effects? So about 6 million years ago, there were 10,000 people. Okay, 5,000 years ago, we moved to 50 million people. In the Common Era, and by the Common Era, I mean about 200 years ago, 250 million people. And today, we're up to 6 billion people. Some of the new technologies that were formed at this time period: looms for textiles and cloths, pottery, which allowed for the storage of food, and that allowed for the help of surplus of food, and then these massive irrigation projects that helped to develop sedentary societies. And that leads into our social organization. So we're going to see some common patterns of social organization around the world. For example, one of the big common patterns is people migrated and then settled down was the development of hierarchy with some kind of organized leader. And we talked about this in class, the notion of the big man who eventually becomes the monarch, who then creates a military for protection and uses a religious class in order to justify that. Sumeria is a good example. In Sumeria, we have the notion of divine privilege, which justifies not only the big man, but what eventually becomes the king. The creation of irrigation projects and bureaucracies that then help to develop agricultural surpluses. In China, bronze tools are developed along with irrigation projects and a hierarchy. In India, the Aryans migrate down, invade, and then create a racial caste system justified upon religious beliefs of karma and inequality. And all of this is due to the fact that we're seeing this migration and expansion. As people migrate out, they form small cities, but that eventually leads into trade between these cities and creates these big trade routes that we've been talking about all year: the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Silk Road. That creates new types of technology for migration, such as iron and horse stirrups, in order to make sure that these different cities and eventually empires will have military power. And that then leads into these new big societies. So in the classical empires, we're eventually going to see groups like the Persian, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Sumerians. In Mesoamerica, the kingdoms of the Olmecs and the Toltecs. In China, the confederation of the Jia eventually centralized and formed together into the Shang dynasty. The Bantu are going to move down and form their port cities on eastern Africa using new types of metallurgy, such as iron, spreading out the Swahili language. So notice how the basis to all of this is climatic change, forcing people into migrating out, and then as they find new areas, settling down and then creating these massive civilizations. So what are some of the commonalities then that we see from migration? Well, first of all of these societies ended up forming hierarchies in order to manage land and resources. Governments emerged in order to create bureaucracies, and this eventually led to the division of labor, which was created to specialize who would do these tasks. Typically what we saw within all of these societies was that you would have landowners. The landowners would then have some type of serf or people who would rent their land. But then those people so outnumbered the landowners You would need a government that would help to both protect the rights of the landowners as well as manage the needs for irrigation. That creates bureaucracies, and as bureaucracies are created, that creates a need for these people to fulfill that. And if you think of, like, for example, in China, the reason why that's so important is who are you going to fulfill these bureaucracies? Well, we develop a civil service exam that will do that. And off of that civil service exam, who's going to pass those? Well, it's going to be the people who are going to end up getting the best tutors to make sure the family is honored by getting people into those positions. So you're actually creating, each step is creating more and more of these offices and these hierarchies within society. Another big thing that's created at this time is written languages. Written languages become so important for recording purposes. And, we talked about in class the difference between oral and written language. And I know the common opinion, very understandably, within our classes have been, well, written languages must be more credible, right? Because written languages are written down, they're stored, you can pass them on from generation to the next. But if you really think about it, like we talked about in class, a written language is written from the perspective of whoever is writing it. And who are the people who are writing it? Well, it would be that small percentage of people in the government who are backing up landowners who are attempting to record things down to justify the way the hierarchy is. So is it really a way for us to get accurate knowledge? Or do we need to read it through the point of view of the elite who are up at the top of the society, who make up a very small percentage of that society? Most of the governments also formed a priestly class in order to justify the society, and they would justify the society based upon their view of the gods, and the view of the gods tended to be a connection with nature. Well, migration then gets attached, of course, from what we've been talking about, to trade. City-states, villages, and small kingdoms did war against each other. This was a typical thing, but most of our evidence seems to suggest that a war was actually the exception, not the norm. The norm was actually interaction with trade. And there are major impacts to this. The more that you interact with trade instead of war, in the case of war, you're getting rid of a civilization. In the case of trade, you're diffusing civilizations. So that means you're going to have a variety of goods, you're also going to have disease, and you're going to have a diffusion of culture. And so the way historians kind of characterize this period is one known as interconnecting bubbles. In other words, we really don't have people disconnected from one another, but we also don't have what we see today, which is almost people living on top of each other through the virtual world. Rather, what we see are bubbles of civilizations that are connected indirectly through different trade routes, diffusing culture, diffusing goods, diffusing ideas, diffusing even disease. And of course, then there are the justifications for this. What are these original religious beliefs that would be used to justify the system that we're getting? So we know later on in human history we're going to see the notion of monotheism, but that was not the basic beginnings. The beginnings of most of society was based upon the connection to nature. So our big religions we want to remember are naturalism, pantheism, and animism. Naturalism being that the gods reside within nature. Pantheism, the belief in multiple gods. And animism, the belief that gods would be represented and manifested through animals. And if you think about it, this really has some very important impacts that we need to think about. Why is it, for example, that Hindus believe so strongly in the idea of reincarnation? Where does that come from? Well, if you believe that the gods reside within nature, then at that point, that means all spirit, all energy resides within nature. So what happens to somebody who is dead? Where do they go? Well, their spirit returns. Their spirit is a part of this overall energy of life, and the spirit comes back. Why does that matter? Well, because that leads into things like ancestor worship. It leads into things like the importance of family. It leads into the family being the caretakers of the land that is given from one generation to the next. And this really ties people to their land and how important land is. And of course, this leads into the big issue that we're going to be talking about throughout this unit. Is labor coerced? Is migration coerced? Or is it voluntary? The movement of the people eventually meant that we would have landowners and renters. Some would be conquered prisoners of war. That obviously is coerced. Some would sell themselves into slavery to pay off debts. Well, that's kind of bridging the gap, right? I mean, somebody sold themselves off. That's voluntary, but they were in debt, so that is kind of a forced coercion as well. But the largest problem overall is the lack of arable land. We're talking about Africa. We're talking about the Middle East. We're talking about Egypt. I mean, these areas do not have the best of land. And when farmers are able to settle down and actually own land and then have people rent from it, and the land itself is close to very flooded areas, the big question that comes up is this really voluntary, or is it something that's coerced? So some of the big takeaways I want you to take away from this PowerPoint as we start this unit and start to think of, as we're wrapping up everything together for the year now, starting to think of how different things kind of relate to each other. It's not a monocausal type of issue. There's not a cause and effect, but rather an ecology of relationships. Most of human history really is tied together through movement and trade. These are our two big continuities in human history, movement and trade. We know that climactic changes were what kind of pushed people in different directions. And when we think of climactic changes, some of the big natural ones to just keep in mind are the Earth's tilt towards the sun or away from the sun, increased sunlight, or volcanic activity, forcing humans to go out and search for resources. Once people start to settle down from this migration, they're going to start creating classes and hierarchy due to limited land. And the governments then create a way to protect that and to give meaning to that. So at the base root, when we think about all the things human beings do, it really is tied back again and again to the issue of movement and trade. And how does movement and trade then impact the way we relate to one another and the societies that we create?